Well, hello everyone. My name is Gabe Coyle. I am the campus pastor at Christ Community's downtown campus.
I'm Tim Spanburg, campus pastor in Shawnee.
And we are kicking off a whole new series of videos here on Mondays in this first section of Genesis, chapters roughly 1 through the beginning of chapter 12. And so on Mondays, after we spent some time preaching together, digging into God's Word on Sundays, we're going to dive into a couple extra questions, point to a couple extra resources to better equip us as a church to be thoughtful when we're engaging Scripture. So I'm really excited about this. I don't know why they put me here in the first one, so hopefully we can set off a good template for everybody that's following, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure why they asked you either.
So
I know you're reading Genesis 1.
A little bit.
Yeah.
And actually, so are all of you, right? Maybe. If you're engaged with Open here, which is so easy to do. If you're not, you can go online and you can register and we'll send you an email. Even has an audio file. So you can be listening to Genesis as we're reading through the whole book of Genesis together. It's going to be pretty exciting. And we're going to be journeying through this book. I'm pretty excited. I've been really enjoyed reading through Genesis afresh, personally.
Yeah, well, it's a book, probably well known. We read it, it's the start of the Bible, so, I'm going to read through the Bible this year, and you generally make it to Genesis 15, 16 maybe, before you stop. But, rereading it now, how are you seeing it fresh?
I think one of the biggest surprises for me, and it's not going to be for a little while, so just hold your horses. One of the things that really surprised me is just how much Joseph cries. And if you get really vigorous, and you want to read a lot of Genesis and you get to Joseph, just notice how much he cries, which now as a parent, I just cry all the time. And so...
Yeah, she was crying just before this video started.
I sometimes cry thinking about crying.
But for different reasons, I think.
But in all seriousness, okay, so we're in Genesis, right? And we just launched yesterday. I can't believe it. Yesterday in Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1. And Tim, I've learned a ton from you. Just about, the world of Genesis is so weird, and there are a lot of cultural reasons for why that is. And there's been a couple of folks who have been really helpful voices in this process to help us understand why Genesis feels so weird. And so, Tim, I wonder if you enlighten us a little bit to some of those key voices and why this feels so weird.
Yeah, one of the questions I pushed into yesterday in Shawnee is, so Genesis 1 starts, and basically the second, third word in Genesis is God. Like, God creates everything, but for many of our neighbors, our coworkers, our friends, like the idea that God creates, that's a hurdle. Like that there's a supernatural being that exists that creates everything. And so there's this Canadian philosopher, Charles Taylor is his name, and he wrote this book. It's like 900 pages long, and but it's basically about one question, which is why in 1500, 500 years ago, why was it basically impossible not to believe in God then? But today, not only do people not believe in God, but that just seems like kind of assumed is true. Like, yeah, there's no God, there's no one created.
It's a boogeyman. It's something you believed when you were little.
Yeah, but 500 years ago, no one would have, it's not that they would have thought atheism versus Christianity. There's probably a God. Like the thought of there not being a God just wasn't even possible. And so I think that's a challenge for us is we live in a time when, in the beginning, God is a really difficult thing, whereas 500 years ago it wasn't even thinkable. And then you get further into Genesis 1, and it's not just that God creates, but that the way He creates. And so it's God said, let there be light. God said, let there be moon, stars, sun. God said, let there be animals. Which there's this sense that all of creation around us isn't just this stuff that's there, but it's actually God's spoken word. The tree outside the window is that's His spoken creation. And so for us as Christians, we believe all around us is God's spoken word that's creation. But for a lot of our neighbors, friends, coworkers, they're like, God, that doesn't compute.
Right. It just seems like something that's a part of an imaginative fairy tale world. Why don't you come back to the real world where everything I can touch, taste, see, and smell, all those things with our faculties, that's what's real, and that's it.
Yeah. So one resource that's helpful, I mentioned Taylor. He wrote this 900-page book dealing with this question. Well, I read, there's another guy, James Smith, who wrote a summary of that book. It's about 140 pages long, so you can guess which book I actually read. I did not read Taylor in 900 pages. But this is a helpful summary, and I think would be helpful to you, thinking through your friends, family, coworkers, who don't believe in God. who have a really hard time with this supernatural framework that Genesis 1 just assumes. Smith, summarizing Taylor, kind of helps you into that world, helps us understand why our neighbors have a difficult time getting to believe in God and getting to believing in Genesis 1:1.
So unpack a little bit. You and I have been on this journey together too, as we've entered into Genesis 1:1 and the world of just Genesis. There's such a richer world in Genesis than I often care to admit. I don't even realize half the time how I'm so impacted as a 21st century modern person in my perception of time. I often view time in terms of instant access, via email, via text. Like time is something that happens quickly, where in an older agricultural context, and even agricultural contexts around the world, time is something that happens in season. Like I'm so culturally conditioned that when I step into Genesis, I miss so much. And I think, frankly, I've missed so much just even around the word God, which seems really bad as a pastor.
Yeah. So you want to talk about Elohim?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So this is going to be a stretch maybe for some of you. But in Genesis 1:1, the first verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God, the Hebrew word there is Elohim, but our English word is capital G, God, which sounds like it's God, the name God. But Elohim is a more general. It's a more general term.
It's more of a title.
Yeah,
it is a proper name.
Yeah. So if I was to define Elohim, which I did yesterday, Elohim is an inhabitant of the spiritual world. So in the beginning, an inhabitant of the spiritual world created the heavens and the earth. And so this term Elohim gets used a lot in the Hebrew Bible. And one of the most confusing places for people is Psalm 82. So Psalm 82, the first verse, it's this. It's God, Elohim, God, like the God of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew God, Elohim, has taken his place in the divine council. It's like, what's that? In the midst of the gods, in the midst of the Elohim, he holds judgment. It's like, what? So like, are there many gods? Is the Bible teaching that? And so just hold on. So there's only one God, but there's many Elohim. And so what you find in Genesis 1, and this is the assumption they had in this world, is that God creates like two types of beings, right? He creates human beings that inhabit the physical world that you and I see, and he also creates like this divine council, this Elohim, this unseen realm, and in order for God to mediate his rule, mediate the way he wanted the world to run, both through supernatural beings and as well as through human beings. And so like God doesn't just create Genesis 1 and say, I'm the one, I have all, the power, I'm going to do everything myself. No, he creates these two types of beings to mediate his love and his rule and his reign throughout all of creation. All right, like Gabe, you help me here.
So Elohim, I mean, a great example of this is like when you follow just the word Elohim throughout the text. It's sometimes used for, these other gods or goddesses that are not the God of the Bible. It's sometimes used of angels, which we would go, okay, those folks definitely inhabit some sort of different plane of reality. But it's also used for human beings after they're deceased, when Samuel is like brought up by the witch at Endor, which is a crazy story. And then also demons. Like there's just this bigger reality to what's actually taking place in God's creation sum total than I often care to admit. And I often just think, oh God, that's this guy, triune, sure, he's Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but that's just, I have such a shortened, flattened view of the world rather than this expansive, glorious picture who the one true Elohim over all the other Elohim is. It's pretty astounding.
Well, and it's not a storyline that stops at Genesis 1 either. And so, I mean, which is Psalm 82, but the New Testament picks this theme up. So I was reading Revelation this morning, and in Revelation 1, you have, there's 7 angels for the 7 churches, right? Right, so God's mediating his rule throughout the world. So there's the church, which is announcing the gospel, the good news to the world, but there's also like angels connected to those churches. Which, this is strange stuff to us because we don't think about this. But also then in Ephesians 6, when Paul is writing to a church in the midst of all kinds of evil and injustice and human rulers, he says, principalities and powers, for we do not wage against flesh and blood. And there's this sense in which there's this unseen reality, both of good and evil, that bumps up against the way humans want the world to go, which is why often the evil is very complex, and often why it's like there's not just like evil, but there's powers, there's principalities.
Yeah.
And all that starts in Genesis 1 when God doesn't just create human beings to rule on the earth, but there's this Elohim, there's this divine council that's to mediate his rule. And in Genesis 1, of course, it's supposed to be all good, and later we find there's not just good attached to this, there's evil, there's bad, like it's a mixed bag. And it's all packed in there in Genesis 1, and oftentimes I think because we have a hard enough time believing there's one God who created the world, the thought that there is this unseen realm that's a part of our experience that we don't see, it's hard for us to believe. And if you're like, gosh, this is strange stuff. There's another book here, another resource, Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser, that's been helpful to me in understanding how Genesis 1 isn't just describing the world we see, but also a world we don't see that's infused with other beings.
Well, and this is why it's so important when we come to Genesis. When we come to Genesis, we have to remember it was not written to a 21st century modern context with people asking 21st century modern questions. Now, it answers human questions because in some sense human questions pervade throughout every generation of humanity. But it was written to ancient Near Eastern folks over 3,000 years ago who have a different framework for how the world works. And maybe a better framework for how the world works than we would maybe sometimes care to admit. And now, look, there's so much that can be said on this. We are barely scratching the surface. But I hope what it does is it makes it feel like you're taking off virtual reality goggles in a world that we often make for ourselves, and you begin to see the real world. And it's so much bigger, the colors are so much more vivid, and this God is so much better and glorious and huge and worthy of our worship than we could have ever imagined. And so in the midst of that, we've got some other resources around Genesis that might be really helpful. When you come to the Genesis text, you're coming to an English translation of a Hebrew text in a broader Hebrew culture. Mm-hmm. And to understand a text, you also need to understand some images. And so Zondervan's Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary is really good at helping you even get into some of the archaeological evidence and some of the archaeological pictures and some of the broader stories that were predominant around that text and around our text in its time. Another great work is by Bruce Waltke and his Old Testament theology. I feel like I'm on Reading Rainbow. I just keep holding up books here.
Well, that book's way longer than Reading Rainbow.
But this one it's a great systematic theology of the whole Old Testament, but he also walks through text by text and giving you some brilliant insight into this brilliant Elohim, the one true Elohim over all the earth, who's guiding and working throughout history. And then Robert Alter, his little 5 books of Moses, he actually goes back and does a more literal and more culturally relevant English translation of the Hebrew. He's a brilliant Hebrew scholar. And so I've really appreciated his work as well as some of the comments below his translation as a really, really great resource in this journey. So many books, more than you have time to read, but maybe you'll find one that you really like.
Well, and if you're not into books, podcast, the Bible Project podcast, back in October, they have basically everything we said about Elohim. They spend several hours on.
Yes.
And so it starts in about October. It's God is sort of the episodes that goes by, and it'll help you kind of dive into this world Genesis 1 is talking about in far more details than we could do, in just a few minutes. And if I could say, like, why bring that up? Like, what's the point? If I could summarize all of that. My hope in preaching Genesis 1 yesterday and you watching this video now is you get the sense that, we're, as Taylor would say, like, we have a hard time believing in the supernatural, a hard time believing in God. And yet if you really push into what Genesis 1 is saying, is that when you look at this world around us, there's so much more than meets the eye. Like the tree you're looking at is God's spoken creation. Genesis 1:14, the stars, the moon, the sun, those are signs that point to a reality beyond themselves. I think any of us, when we look at a night sky, it's like, gosh, this sense that everything I see is not all there is. And so my hope in maybe pushing some boundaries here with Genesis 1 is to say, like, this world around you is infused with meaning and reality that's far more than meets the eye. And that's what Moses, I think, when he wrote Genesis 1, was trying to get his people to see, is this creation all points us back to this one creator, God. And so often we get just stuck in our Monday to Friday life where it's like we're looking down, we're just getting through things, and we missed this creation infused with supernatural meaning all around us.
And I think that's what's been so fresh for me, is that this is in no way, shape, or form in opposition to the orthodox belief that maybe you've had for a while or wrestling with. So don't anyway go away and go like, oh my goodness, the God I've always believed. No. Actually, it's just so much richer than we could have ever imagined.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's been so fresh for me is I feel like I've been looking not in black and white, but with duller colors, that's a tough phrase to say, duller colors, and all of a sudden they've just been more vibrant in the world in which we find ourselves. So I hope this has been a helpful time for you, a hopeful, sharpening time, a place that really it sparked more questions. And feel free to use the bottom for comments and to continue to process as we're journeying through this brilliant, beautiful book of Genesis. It's been great to be together. Thanks so much.